Good morning, everyone. I see a lot of people have already put in their farm name and their pesticide license in there for the credits. Also, your name, your farm name needs to be presented. And we need that information. Even if you're not going for pesticide credits, please put down name and your farm name as well. So we need to record that for our quorum for our business meeting again we have coming in at noon. So please take the time to enter that in for us in the chat box area. And I guess when we have questions for our presenters, you can go type those questions, and Jason will read the questions later in their presentation, probably end of the presentation. So just keep that in mind as we go forward with this. But we're about ready to get started, and I'd like to introduce Jason Mauck. He's a farmer from Indiana. I like what he's definitely somebody who thinks outside the box thinking, trying different things, learn from his mistakes, and get better at what he does. He is from 2003, was a marketing graduate from Ball State University, and he's constantly experimenting to make cropping better and more effective. After graduating, Jason took some different jobs to learn from different industry, how they do things. And then he started a landscaping mowing business before returning to his family farm. And he was named one of the 10 up and coming farmers in agriculture. So I think I'll turn this over to Jason, let him take over the program. And as I said before, please type in your name and farm name, your pesticide license. And then later in the program, probably in the afternoon, you have to type in your name, your farm name, your pesticide license once again. If you have questions for Jason as we're in this program, please type that in. Jason Post will read them out at the end of the presentation, if that makes sense, Jason. So we won't interrupt you what you're doing. And then we'll take it from there. So Jason, welcome aboard. Thank you for willing to take the time to start off our program for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. So thanks everyone for your attention. I know that's really valuable these days. And I want to share the next hour or so. I call this 5 years of mistakes. It's maybe an explanation of why I'm so weird. But I look at farming a little bit differently from my past experience, and we'll kind of go through that. And I like to start with this photograph right here. This is 1957. This is a Chevy plant in Muncie, Indiana, just down the road from me. And I've got two grandfathers here. Can you guys see my cursor by chance right there, David? If you can see,
Yes,
okay.
we can,
So,
Jason.
oh, perfect. So right here is my Papa Lou, and that's my grandpa Mauck that I still farm with. He had 3 sons. One of them was my father. You know, in 1957, everything was about productivity and efficiency. And I think we're still kind of in that plane on farming. And I want to add another dimension, which is significance, or what can we do today? What can we experiment? Who can we connect with that's going to change what we can do tomorrow? And the reason I've changed quite a bit in the last few years was both my grandfathers, like I said, that he and my father died of pancreatic cancer at 53. I watched him just work and build the farm up to where it is, and I watched him go away. And then my new father was Papa Lou's son, Louis, and the same thing happened to him. So I'm one of the luckiest persons in the United States to be the son of 2 prosperous farmers, and 2 of them at 53 lost their life to cancer. And I'm not shooting any guns here. I'm just saying that I do not wake up in the morning wanting to farm 10,000 acres. I look at things I want to be a change agent. So I look at things a little bit differently there. So instead of waking up and saying, you know, how can I grow the most corn or beans? You know, what can I do today to make tomorrow maybe a little bit better, a little bit more time with my family? So in the midst of this, I started experimenting really hardcore about 2016 with cover crops and different cropping. And I'll get into that why, because I came from a landscaping background. One thing that kind of got me a little bit more attention, probably the reason why I'm talking to you today, is I started experimenting with all this manure that we have. So our farm raises about 25,000 pigs a year. I've got 4 million gallons of hog manure. And we have quite an amount of fertility, but we have a lot of fresh nitrogen. So after this was my 3rd year of intercropping, I made this little contraption here, a Gandy box that would seed wheat right above our manure injection on 60-inch rows. And I bought an old combine. So the 2 previous years we were using our big S680 and running over our crop. And I started saying, okay, I can buy old equipment. I can start kind of going from what I've learned. Let's see if we can optimize this idea of relay cropping, plant multiplication, and all that kind of stuff. So I bought this old 9600 at about 3,500 hours for $14,000. And I brought this old beater back home, and I started, I made the head a little bit different. So up front, you see these little pads, and the combination of those 2 things produced this video right here, which was our 2nd annual Constant Canopy Field Day. But I started getting on Twitter, and I invited everyone to come out to harvest this wheat. And I showed everyone how this progressed. My soybeans were now taller than the wheat. And honestly, I was really nervous that this was going to be a flop, because we went out the night before and we were breaking some of these soybean plants over. But this plot right here, I put 17 different soybean varieties. So I wanted to see, as I changed the variables in the beans and their lifespan and their size, how it changed in this specific context of manure injected wheat with intercrop soybeans. And you can just see I had a little 15-foot head here, and this mirrored the manure tank. So I didn't need all my guidance and all that stuff like that. So everyone came out and watched me do this. And we didn't get a lot of wheat. We got 32 bushel wheat out of this experiment here, but our soybeans went over 100 bushels per acre. And after doing this and changing the variables slightly every year, now I'm in a position where I'm more comfortable growing soybeans with another crop next to it. Because if I can figure out kind of this spectrum analysis, I can figure out, okay, water is usually a liability early in a crop's life cycle. I want to keep my root hairs. I want to put it in a position to grow better. And that's, we're kind of mostly this presentation will be wheat and soybeans. I've got corn and soybeans, and now we're starting to do intergrazing. We're starting to do direct marketing, and I kind of show how what we've learned has kind of progressed through the years here. If I can get past here, there we go. So that was, we had 17 varieties. 7 total went over 100, with the top one at 108 bushels per acre. So this is my house. It's what I walk out every day. I've got my American flag, and I've got this big oak tree, and this is a product of the environment. Everything in nature has neurons. It's constantly figuring out, okay, what is my upside? How can I grow in this environment? This tree right here is probably 20 times of greater mass than that same tree if I would put it in a forest and it had to compete for light and nutrients and water with everything else. So everything in nature we can kind of toy with a little bit, and when we put them in systems, that's where it starts getting interesting. So 2017, I've got a 6 and a 5-year-old now. My oldest was potty training. We were using the summer the best we could, you know. That's the best time to potty train kids. And we took this 1197 corn plant out of the garden. I planted it by itself, and I gave it space all around. And we used it for potty training. So it had plenty of nitrogen, spoon-fed nitrogen. But this corn plant produced 31 ears from this one seed. And it's pretty amazing, because I dug it up after it emerged. So it instantaneously recognized its environment. It grew another sucker. Every single node produced an ear. The ears started growing leaves on themselves, and it took about 6 weeks from the first ear to the last ear was produced. So if you think, okay, if we can make plants kind of do this, how can we change the schematics to where we mess with the populations, the row spacings, and the solar angles to put them in a position to design plants? Because the problem is, we all know commodities are going up, but we also know fertilizer is going to go up, chemicals going to go up, seeds going to go up, and we're constantly trying to outrun, you know, in this big ag cycle. So until we change a little bit and get more value per entity, it's going to be really hard to create the margins. And this is just the way nature grows. Cell division, Fibonacci sequence. If you cut that corn plant, that previous corn plant, if you cut it and you see the swirls at V7, it's got the little tassel in there. It's got a little ear in there. Nature is always ahead of ahead of the curve. And your warmest day follows 3 or 4 weeks after the warmest solar day. The water lags behind into late August. Your hurricanes come about in September when the water's warm, and soil is probably the biggest lagger of them all. When we start increasing the biological, the carbon we're pumping in the soil and all the life, it's just everything takes a little bit of time. So this is why I do what I do. If we can figure out systems put in place, use proxy for weed control, different things, then we don't have to spend as many trips across the field, which in turn gives me more time to take my kids to the river and maybe makes that river a little bit cleaner. But a lot of people think this is risky, and I would argue that not doing anything is risky. We all know that change is going to happen. So I have really used social media as a way to put ideas out there when they first come about and get the value of all these people that are looking and listening to my ideas of, hey, this might not work, or this, look out for this. And that's really an interesting thing when you start experimenting, of tapping into everyone's prior experience. I do a lot of whiteboarding. I do a lot of chalkboard, a lot of to figure out schematics and figure out how this would work and play out. But you'll never see me draw a straight line. Everything's always curved. And I'll get into relationships here as we go forward. But I think agriculture, I've got a 5 and a 6-year-old. I really don't see them having the same life as when I was 5 and 6. I think things are going to change. We've got to create a market, and we've got to think a little bit more blue ocean, because we're doing all the same thing. We're missing out on huge growth opportunities that there are when we create. And we've got to look at a lot of these businesses come about. The brick and mortar system is expensive. Companies like Uber have went around that. You've got Airbnb, you've got Amazon that's figured out how to fulfill a need. And you got to boil down in ag, what need are we actually fulfilling is to feed people. So there's a lot of systems in place, we're moving things a lot, and there's going to be a lot of pressure with the carbon economy of simplifying this entire system. So a little bit about my background. As David alluded to, I had a couple years in sales, 2 or 3. I was in insurance and in home improvement. I figured out how to get people on paper. Then I started a landscape contracting business here in Muncie. Not a huge town, about 60 to 80,000 people. We had about 7 employees. And I did a lot of commercial business, nursing homes, higher income people's homes, at a lot of these, I call these living billboards, where we would put these flower displays, and we would always want color. And we wanted that color from March all the way into Christmas. So that required, with annuals, most annuals only bloom anywhere from 6 to 6 months, 6 weeks to 6 months. We had to use multiple plants to accomplish and really stand out. We didn't advertise. We just tried to put quality living billboards out there, and the word of mouth would work on. But look right here, we got 4 foot, and you've got all these plants. You've got these big can of bulbs. We're collecting solar energy on all different angles. This is just a sign there at my farm. And not only this is late September here, we've got different crop architecture, different sizes. But we had crocuses and pansies up front in the spring, and then I would interplant my summer plants, because I could buy 64 of them for $8 instead of waiting for them to be bigger. And by planting things a little bit earlier, I could use other plants as frost protection. I could get them to root in really deep, so they were big and established by the time summer came around. And it really became a tactical thing, not only from saving money on the plant end, but having more resilient plants through the course of the summer, if I could think and protect them and plant them a little bit earlier. But also, when I was a landscaper, I was responsible for hundreds of acres. So we would grow our grass really tall and thick, and we wouldn't have to spray herbicide over the top. We wouldn't get the crabgrass pressure. So when I came to the farm, and it was thought that we needed to be clean slate, that we wanted to maximize one entity by basically killing off everything else, it just really didn't make much sense to me. We had all this manure, and we were fighting some really mean pigweed. We were getting a carpet of winter annuals in the wintertime. So this is 2017, the second year of this concept. And this is when I had 37-inch wheat, but we put a cover crop out there that will winter kill, that does a couple jobs. When we put the manure application out there, we have a lot of ammonium nitrogen and phosphorus. So that'll allow those radishes to grow. That leaf is really large and it'll block the ability for a winter annual to establish in the fall time, but also captures those nutrients and will give that off to the wheat. And the wheat really greens up quick. In the springtime, we get really excessive tillering. So when we put excessive tillering from the manure in the context of wider rows with lower plant populations, then we can get a lot more plant yield. And I'll get into the weeds a little bit. We're trying to maximize plant yield in 2 different crops in 2 different seasons. And if we can add a 3rd dimension, a 4th dimension, animals, the more the merrier into this system. But this was, like I said, 3 or 4 years ago. So this is a picture of 2019, which was really wet in our part of the woods. I think we got over 10 inches of rainfall in April and May. We started turning our wheels at scale in June. But we planted our soybeans April 7th to the 9th that year in the relay context. And I think we're out here in mid-April trying to see where them beans are. So the difference between a cover crop and a relay crop is, especially with a cereal, is we don't kill the wheat. We let it go through its whole lifespan. And it's consuming water when water is a liability. When we're trying to plant our summer annual out there and we're getting bombarded with 2 or 3 inch rains, we're not getting the oxidation in the soil. We're killing off our root hairs and really killing our top end of our summer annual. Where we can find a place where we can plant this next to a cereal. And when we get that water, not only can we infiltrate it in place, but we're consuming it. Those root fibers, root hairs are in the soil structure. So we're oxidizing the roots and we just create a better environment for the soybean. But we can't be too greedy. Everything not only is biological, but it's also finite mathematics, and wheat will consume an acre inch, so an inch across an acre for every 3 bushels that we produce. So if we go for the moon and we multiple nitrogen, apply our wheat, we plant it really thick, we fungicide it, now we got 110 bushel wheat, we've almost drunk all the water in the soil profile. So not only have we took all the sunlight and all the calendar year to grow that crop, not to say you couldn't put a cover crop or double crop beans and get lucky and it rains and get value, but if we go back on that curve and say, okay, we're going to raise 40 or 50 bushel wheat, then we can take that rain that was is too much liability and get it into a much better scenario where these soybeans have a better environment. So through changing the variables, I've kind of figured out and kind of came to this schematic of 60-inch on center wheat. All my combines are on 120-inch spacing, so I can go right over the wheat row with single tires or tracks and put the soybean 10 or 11 inches off the row, which creates a 4-row wheat or manure strip or strip till, but I want the wheat about 22 inches wide on 60-inch centers, and then I plant twin row beans in between. Now, I'd like to add some more beans there. We've experimented with hood spraying where we don't spray over the wheat and go through that stress. And I'd like to get some more soybeans in there to expedite canopy closure a little bit quicker. If we can expedite canopy closure, then we don't allow that soil to get hot, which is kind of that convective temperature that makes those a lot of these summer annual weeds take off. Pigweed, the soil needs to get hot for it to really spark. You don't see it till later in the year. So if we kind of beat it to its spot, kind of like we did with the cover crops in the wintertime, we can fight off those weeds through offense that way. We just see how that progresses. So putting in a schematic like this allows every entity to have plentiful sunlight, and actually more sunlight than if we would push populations with one entity. A lot of people give me crap here. We don't put a lot of clothes on our kids when it warms up. We save a lot on laundry detergent at that stage, but you can just see all the solar hitting every entity out here. Another thing too, we're not Illinois. We have timber soils. The topsoil is not very deep, but when we start getting rolling hills, if we get that big cow piss and 2-inch rain, in 20 minutes, we can physically stop that rainfall on the side of the hill. We can infiltrate it in place, And yeah, we are consuming some water on those lighter soils, but we're also putting a water preserver in place later in the summer. So we lay all that thatch out there. And since we collected rainfall on the side of the hill and now we have a preserver, we might have consumed, say, 10 inches of rainfall in the spring, but it would have ran down the hill anyway. So we'll probably be in a better position for that summer annual in more of the landscape part of the field later on in the season. There's a picture of that later on. So eventually we expedite canopy closure for a couple reasons. A, we can definitely go to canopy on the wheat, you know, in mid-April, but we can make the soybeans grow a little bit better because they don't have a bad day. If it rains a bunch, they're not going to sit there and kind of hate life for a while. They're going to grow good collectively, and we can expedite canopy closure in 2, 3, 4 weeks in that system. So looking at it from a life cycle analysis, you've got your nursing home cereal here to the left and right. So it's going to basically stop photosynthesizing in mid-June in my latitude. And then I've got an adolescent right next to it that's going through rapid growth. So that adolescent is going to push against that wheat, which further ratchets the canopy tightness, and weeds just can't grow in that space. So like I said before, we're doing some hood spraying where we're making devices to only put our herbicide in between the wheat. The wheat will fend for itself. You've got a little allelopathy there, but it's just strictly going to be canopy in that space. And there's just a picture of what that looks like in late June. And we've got this harvest down now where the beans can get quite a bit taller than the wheat. And we figured out that you can bend them down to 8 or 10 inches and they'll be fine. So a lot of people will drive by this field and just wonder how in the heck I'm going to get this weed out of here, but it's really not too difficult here. So no, I can get out of here. Yeah, I was worried about that. Okay, so there's Bogey, Love and Life. You can see the size of those wheat heads too. You know, everything can flex multiple different ways. If you give more sunlight per leaf, you're going to get bigger, more robust grain out of every wheat head there. There's a picture of the kids there when we were harvesting that live. And you can see these flexi fingers. These are really neat. I can take them on and off the combine really quickly. There's just a little 10mm bolt that goes up against that bed knife and tightens that down. I just loosen that up and I can just snap them off with a spring. A lot of these fields now, I'm not doing relay cropping on the in-rows. We're doing solid wheat, and then we're going to go graze those in-rows later in the summer with a C4 grass. This is what we actually want, and we want to prune. So this was an old landscape trip. If you had a big bush that had a lot of dead stuff in there, you cut that out, allow sunlight energy into the plant, and it would just get healthier. And we don't recognize this, but when we put a monocrop out there, we're only collecting solar energy at the top of the plant. So when it's producing those nodes first, then those nodes the photosynthesis doesn't really translocate down to that part of the plant. Now, when we change it to a system like this, we can prune out the cereal, and it had the ancillary benefits of being the big brother that consumed the water and the fibrous roots and the exudates that the soybeans could get in there and get more mineral and nutrients. But also now it opens up the light to these soybeans. So these soybeans are in R2, R3, making all these pods and grain that pays you. And that can get so much more light at that time. Also, we can use these beans that are big beans that normally we would put in a monocrop situation. They grow really tall and in fertility, they fall down, and it changes their motive. So now they're going to grow outward instead of upward. Every node has full energy, so we're producing pods on every node instead of just the fresh nodes that are up top. So it's not all good. There is some bad things I'll get into that from a yield perspective. I would much rather have my crops in this situation set up in R2 and R3 than a monocrop field. Also, we're getting some wind flow in there, so your dew's going to dry off earlier in the morning. You're not going to have as much white mold pressure and that kind of stuff. And then we have a solar reflection as well. If you go back there, we're reflecting solar energy off the soil surface. So if that would be bare, I'd be growing water hemp off the yin yang. If it was bare, I would be getting hot, so I would be evaporating, moisture. We're collecting, but we're also reflecting sunlight. You get the albedo effect, which is kind of weird this year. We had about 15 inches of snow on the ground in late February. Usually we're warming up, but we're reflecting 90% of that sunlight back into the atmosphere, and that's why it's hard to warm up and sustain a warm up this time when you get that much snow. We can basically get the albedo effect with a cereal here as well. So that eventually fills in, and we can change the physiological makeup of soybean plant. The nodes get closer together. We get more nodes. We're seeing 4 or 6 more nodes in this context, and we can use a later maturing soybean. So that was one thing we learned with 17 varieties. We went from a 2.4. We're usually maxing out our plots at 3.0 or 3.1, but we were maxing out yields the deeper we went, the 4.6, the 4.8s, which I couldn't even get to mature in our latitude. But since they are in this position right here, they think the day's longer and they're just capturing more sunlight energy. And also that bean has tons of vegetative energy. And we take that 4-foot tall soybean, we put it down to 2.5 foot, and we can put 26, 30 nodes on it because it's got such a deeper lifespan. This is part of the bad thing when we're creating all these new leaves. You go from that to creating all these new leaves. The plant will actually create leaves lower in the plant and fill in that gap. You are making pods a lot longer per node. So you get some of these laggers. So you got to wait for it to mature. You'll have green pods with the more mature pods. But that's why you've got 4, 5, 6 pods per node instead of 1 or 2. And that's where all your yield comes from. It's not only, it's the number of nodes, number of pods per nodes, and bean size. So if you open up the factory, it's open for business longer, then you're just going to get more production per plant. So you rearrange it to say 15-inch rows. We're trying to expedite canopy closure because we only have 1 row. Now we plug in a wheat in there and we go 20, 40-inch rows, and then we create these solar panels. So goes from, going back here, goes from that to filled up relatively quickly. We're collecting light totally 100% by mid-July. There's only maybe 5 to 10 days where we even have a gap in there, but we've created a bigger venue for solar capture. So from that, and that's your May. That's your June. You can see them little soybean plants in there. Just look at the amount of infiltration of biologicals we're pumping into the soil at that point. And even though we're getting 10, 11 inches of rain, if I have monocrop soybeans out there, I'm going to have yellow all over the field because I'm just losing all oxygen to the roots, but we're actually growing those soybeans in a root there at that point. So there's a picture of that, what that looks like. And we go on. There's more 5. So not a thought here. This looks at shapes. I don't even know where this picture comes from. You see mountains in the back. I assume it's out west. But you look there on the left and you say that's 100% solar capture. That's how you grow fantastic wheat. And maybe it is, but I'm not in the sport of raising fantastic wheat because the previous ideas. I just use it for time and space. But that's 100% linear sun capture. If you look to the right, if we create a shape of wheat like that, then we can create this half pi or 5 architecture where the ground floor, well, so let's go back, we got 60-inch wheat, there's 20 inches on the ground floor, and now we create, it grows out wide up top, and then it grows in a half circle or 5. So if we go from 20 to 35 and we times that by 1.58, now we've got a surface area. Imagine if you got little sticky feet and you had to walk over the St. Louis Arch. And imagine the St. Louis Arch was all wheat heads. Then we can create a shape where we have a surface area of grain up the top, but then have enough discipline to put it wide enough to grow another crop. So when this is in nursing home and I'm having 0 photosynthetic energy going on from mid-June all the way to mid or late July when I'm trying to establish something else, the most valuable days we're getting nothing because we're so greedy to maximize one. We're going to have 2 things and set up a kind of a force multiplier, a slingshot engage to where we can create a venue for the next thing to actually be optimized. So it's never ending. I think the wheat and soybeans is a really easy starting point of this concept, and I think it can be built upon from there. So we just create the shapes just like that. So you can just see here on the left, and eventually that adolescent soybean that's rapidly growing actually engulfs the wheat, where we got to push them down, and we can grab that wheat up pretty easily. So we can do the same thing with animals. Now I'll check the time. I want to get too in the weeds here. But that's really what I'm interested in here is when we start looking at wheat from a contribution standpoint, this is a little bit differently. So if you have one crop, then you need to pay your fixed costs, your variable costs, your wife's cabinets, and maybe she wants to trade minivans that year. You got to pay for it all with that one crop. If you go two crops, we think contribution margin. So if we think, okay, we only want to raise 50 bushel wheat, then we don't have to put half the inputs. We got to put a quarter, or you can pump pig crap and put 1/8 of a seed. If your goal is a lot lower, then you can move your variable costs at a different standpoint there. So then you create that margin between your variable cost and your variable output. And then what's important is the inflection point put on the other entity. So, with wheat, let's say we get to $300 of revenue and we had $100 in variable costs, that would be $200 of contribution margin that we put on top of our margins of soybeans. Now, can we take that relationship and either grow better beans, reduce herbicide application, or some other ancillary benefit to increase the margin of the soybean? If you get both of them, that's where you're cooking with gas there. But we can do the same thing with animals. I think we can get a lot more contribution margin through multiple animal species, still getting that edge effect of your crop, but also closing the loop significantly on your nutrient output. So, it's great to have a CAFO barn and pump the poop to it. That's nice. It's better than buying P&K, but it's even better if we can get a premium for the livestock, have them manage the vegetation and take a dump and take a, urinate in that space in between and just completely close loop the system off. And that's something we did. We had an organic farm this year, not a single pesticide. We not only put sheep in between there to kind of take down the initial crop, but then we followed up with these chicken tractors. We have 13 of these coops. And these chickens we can sell for quite a bit more than our commercial chickens. And this is another thought process, and I'll get back to our cropping. This is just like relay cropping, but from a Uber standpoint, we created these automated farmers markets. So if you look in between these doors, there's 20 different lockers. Each individual locker can do multiple transactions per day. So we're linking this with e-commerce and packaging, so people can get on to munseymeats.com. They can order that organic chicken, they can order beef, they can order honey, they can order cheese, they can order all these farmers products. And we put these things, all we need is 220 amps. We put it right underneath the billboard, and then we can go to venues next to where everyone's at. So this is actually at the entrance of a large supermarket chain at a Harley dealership. And we do commerce there, and we want to scale this here in the next few years across the Corn Belt. So what we're looking at here when we really start messing with spacing and plant populations is a Pareto distribution. So notice that this line is not linear. So let's use corn as an example. If I plant 30,000 corn seeds and I go to 3,000 corn seeds, the linear relationship is not going to give me 1/10 of the yield, because the relevant variables is not seeds. It's the amount of sunlight captured, the amount of moisture, whether it's too much or too little or optimal, and of course fertility and biological they're going to plug into. So that's where we really start messing with the numbers with something like corn and soybeans, is that we can shave that back and increase plant yield into a point where all the corn leaves capture sunlight. And we can actually start using the corn plant as an ancillary benefit from the soybeans. Because what we're seeing, and this is a picture from a plant breeder named James Bates that kind of gave me this chaos idea. He was a plant breeder in Hawaii. And what he was noticing was his plants would shut down in the afternoon. So that hot Hawaiian sunlight and a 90-degree day with high dew points, the plant would just say, I'm done. I'm in protection mode. And you see it when it hasn't rained for a while, a plant will wax over. So we can use the proxy of the plants. As the sun changes position throughout the course of the day, it's going to cast shadows on the plant at the bottom. So if we don't get greedy, then we can milk the curve on one entity, we can localize our nutrient application, and then we can change the heat. We get plenty of ambient light to drive the plant, but just give it a break. Give it a little bit of break from direct sunlight. So we started doing that, and I put this graph on here, and I think this, I talked to people like John Kemp, things like that in regenerative space, and we really start messing with regenerative ag and get the biologicals going. We can shave population, and these plants that were made way back when were more in tune with biology, and you're not going to see a big yield difference of 3,000 seeds from the elite genetics to an old school open pollinated genetic. It's made to be pushed to 35,000 plants. So it's not very expensive to plant 1/10 of the seed, but if you didn't want all the genetics, it's not really as relevant. It's just a picture of a plant, extremely low population, putting on multiple big ears, and then having soybeans. You can see right below my belt there, you got 4 or 5 nodes on each pods on each node on the soybean plant. It's not driven up tall to compete for sunlight because we weren't very greedy on the previous thing. So if you look at it from a contribution standpoint, then if I don't have as much variable cost in that system, then I don't have a very high break even, and it gets really interesting there. So I put 2 curves here on the graph, and this is kind of the relationship that I've seen here in 5 years. When it goes back to the actual finite relevant variables, your wheat, as we push wheat yields and we get that full linear sun capture, we're going to consume too much sunlight, too much water, and it's really going to drive soybeans down. So there's a point in the graph to where we can actually optimize soybean yield levels to higher levels from the ancillary benefits of pruning, of kind of pattern living tile. And then where is the optimized part of this curve where they intercept? It might be right here. If beans are $13 and wheat $6, 90 bushel beans and 40 bushel wheat look really good on a profit, but maybe you get a little bit more aggressive and you start dinging or inflecting on the other entity. You got to figure out where that is. And that's why, I went from 30-inch wheat where I'm getting 100 bushel wheat and trying to relay. And if it doesn't rain, the beans die. So I spend a lot of money. And when you start messing with the variables, this is kind of how this relationship and curve starts to play out. What time is it there? Oh, I'm off. So this is the plants that we produce. This is right above that manure injection. I call this Duggar wheat, 19 kids and counting. It just, the plant changes its physiological makeup. Each one of these tillers can now produce a grain head, and you put it in a context of white rows where they can all collect solar energy, it will produce a lot more grain heads per seed. So that's how we kind of mess with it. And you see these soybeans at the edge of the field. I turned and terminated some bean plants, and this is the one right next to it. So a lot of people, when you terminate a plant, they think that's 100% loss. Well, you've made an opportunity for the adjacent plant. You murdered that plant. You put its nutrients going to be absorbed by the roots of the other plant. You've got more sunlight energy, more water, and it's just going to create a bigger plant. So what's really relevant here is that we're photosynthesizing, and we're creating venues where we're always collecting sun energy. Not only from an advantageous standpoint of more revenue, but from a liability standpoint, we're consuming water, keeping the venue more in a water situation where it's not oversaturated, and we're always pumping and feeding that microbiology down in the soil. So this was my play with the original James Bates idea of random corn plants. And what I do is I look at everything from an idea standpoint. And the first year is I like this idea, but I'm not going to spend any money. I'm actually going to come out and do a little bit of manual labor and figure out the whole spectrum of how I want to either forget this idea the next year or scale it in a way that I learned through not spending any money and just using my eyeballs the previous year. So what we did, we planted 60-inch corn and soybeans. And I did this the previous year. I maximized my corn population, and I got really leggy soybeans that only had about 10 nodes, and then they eventually fell down. They were kind of leggy. So I choked back my population of the corn where I had the same row population as my normal 20-inch corn, which will bring you about 10 and a half or 11 down the row. and I kept that by itself. And then about half the plot, I went out with a hoe and I terminated, and I would have 2 consecutive plants and 3 consecutive plants, 4 consecutive plants, to see not only how the corn plants change through the different opportunities, but how it affected the beans. And where you get in the weeds is agronomically, it's way different than the easy button here on practicality. When I started having 3 consecutive corn plants, I would trigger 4 or 5 ears on the edge corn plants. In the middle one would have 2 or 3, and the beans stayed relatively short. They had that break from direct solar sunlight. The problem was I got succotash when I combined them together, and there is a cleaning mechanism to make that work, but it's a big investment. I don't know if I really want to go down that rabbit hole, but I got a couple videos of what that looks like.
How much years we actually.
And I'll take a drink of water.
Looks like our limits for 3 bigger ones, even as we skip out here. But I am noticing more productive beans, allowing a little bit more light in the
We'll go to one a little bit later there.
tip row, corn bean spectrum analysis plot. And our corners triggered 5 to 7 ears, but we really have 3 big ears. So go back to that math I shared yesterday. At 5.6 thousand plants, if each one averages a pound, that gets you to 100. So
that's 100 bushels per acre. If we can get a 1 pound of production on 1,000 or 5.6 thousand plants, it gets us to 100. So if the inflection point on the soybeans is nothing, if we can get to that, and let's say, the 5.6, that's 1/6 or 16% of our seed cost, $16 in seed, we could squirt nitrogen right on that spot. And, our variable costs are going to be significantly lower. Then you could conceivably make more contribution margin on 100 bushel corn, and then have the cherry on top of 60 or 70 bushel soybeans. You just got to figure out how to separate it. That's how we create margins. Is we don't, I'm not saying I don't farm a lot of acres the normal way, but we can create a lot of margins when we can take advantage of exponential math and this kind of curve here. And corn can flex multiple different ways. It can grow a longer ear. It can grow more kernels around. It can grow multiple ears and grow a deeper corn kernel. And all of that is going to be true if you just change the variables in place. But that's what it looked like. We combined it with a 9600 planter, and you got a spiral seed separator, and basically use the attributes of the seed. The circle soybeans will have more velocity around that gravity, and the corn is flat, so it's got more friction, and you can separate it that way. It's all mechanical and slow, so I don't know how we really scale that beyond that point without a big investment, which could happen. But then you don't plug into the policy, right? You can't go to the ASC office and then just cut you a check for whatever, because they don't know what box to check. So 2018, we planted 60-inch corn. This was the first go about, which is a cover crop in corn, and we harvested it through the same way from the pads. I got a video here, but it's really important to get out to 60 or at least 50 if you're going to grow something in between. Same thing with a weed. I know it's going to stretch out so far in rows. Corn is about 24 inches physiologically from the stalk. So until we get to beyond 45, 46 inches, we're not going to allow enough solar energy to drive that intercrop. So 60 allows that sunlight to come in, which robustly grows the cover crop. The cover crop's going to grow a lot bigger. You got the water as well. The corn is going to draw the moisture out. Really, it's like a mineral rights, if you will. I'm pumping oil. I'm going to pump out the water a lot more towards the corn plants. I'm going to have more moisture in the middle of the row. And we just get a lot more production as far as the cover crop in between there if we widen that out. I think there's going to be a big push in the future towards twin 60-inch corn. There's going to be a lot of farmers that go together and graze those acres off in the fall, and they're going to be able to get more value for that in the marketplace. That's just a picture of me protecting that cover crop, taking out that corn, and then bringing the cattle in afterwards. We didn't do this again. It could be done, but that's why we're intergrazing now. We're creating systems that go autonomously to basically do what we did manually this past year with our sheep and our chicken. But I I wouldn't have done what I did on the organic farm this year if I wouldn't have done this in 2018 and got kind of a feel for how that works. So this is what we, going back to the organic farm, we had 13 of these little coops. We had 6 sheep coops, 2 sheep in each one, and we would just go in between the rows. And you've got, similar to the phi and similar to the Pareto distribution, you have the sigmoid curve. And the sigmoid curve just simply says the growth is never sustainable. And it goes back to the same thought process of you've got your adolescent stage soybeans with your nursing home wheat. Eventually it stops growing, it turns into reproduction because it wants to survive, and it's doing no photosynthesis. In grazing, you create this sigmoid curve. And if you can really look at it, and everyone knows this that grazes, you got to get off of it. You got to disrupt it just enough to get value out of it from a feedstock perspective, and then you get off of it. And what happens is you have multiple sigmoid curves. So if you're too greedy, then you're gonna slough off the root hairs. It's gonna take a while to photosynthesize, and you create a suck zone. It was the same suck zone I was talking about with wheat, where you're waiting 3 or 4 weeks for the next crop to really photosynthesize and get any production off. With grazing, we were moving these animals twice per day to disrupt it just enough so it quickly comes back and grows quickly. And we graze these multiple 3 or 4 times. And I bet if we tracked how much the C4 sorghum Sudan grass grew in the course of the year, we probably grew it 20 or 25 foot tall. So that's 20 or 25 foot tall of growth that we're pushing down to the ground. The earthworms are taking into the soil, and we can just really increase the amount of carbon that we're pumping into the soil. And it becomes this naturally rationing algorithm to where if we can get off of it, then it quickly comes back. So if a weed wants to grow, then we kept everything intact enough to where it'll grow quick and outcompete things. It just really comes down, it's like sports. It's like a corner in the NFL. If he's 5'9" and you've got a really tall wide receiver, you can throw it up in the air and go get it. It's down to a game of matchups. And eventually our sheep were pretty rambunctious. They tore up our coops a little bit, and then we'd have 3 out, and then we'd have 5 out, and I just let them all out eventually once our crop got big, and they could eat the bottom leaves of the corn along with the sorghum Sudan grass, and they just manage it instead of just the coops there. That's a picture of that organic farm from the road. My goal this year was to have 10 entities that produced $10,000 in revenue. One of them was sweet corn. We used the sweet corn to get people out to hopefully sell more meat. There's another picture of the organic farm there. Another thing we did in the same thought process of time and space, we planted sweet corn on 15-foot rows into cereal rye. We allowed the cereal rye to grow with the corn, and then we terminated it with herbicide and planted pumpkins before we terminated it, and then we crimped that over. So what we were trying to do is create a U-pick sweet corn patch that gave people plenty of space, but also marketed the pumpkins while they were out there picking the sweet corn. So the rye isn't going to fend off weeds for the entire growing season. Eventually, especially if your biology is up, the earthworms and the decomposition from the solar is going to break that down, and weeds are eventually going to win. But if we can create a spot where we push the rye down, we put a pumpkin before we do that, and then it grows out, then it will control weeds for a 3 or 4 week time period until the job now is done by these big pumpkin leaves. And from a marketing standpoint, if we can get people to actually pick the pumpkins, they can get on Instagram, they can get on Facebook, and you basically turn everyone into your marketing business, and you can get more value for each entity out here. That was kind of the goal. We also did 120-inch corn with a cover crop. I need to get a slide on here. On this farm, we put pigs in the woods. We did learn quite a bit, meaning we kind of screwed up in their fencing. We would move them every week to a new spot in the woods. The meat was fantastic. We took out all the green on the bottom floor, forest floor, and cut out all the weeds. We can make that organically a silvo pasture. We got to get our fencing down a little bit. But that was just something we did this past year. There's Bogey. And I alluded to earlier, we purchased a meat company last July, which is kind of a means to the end as we go into the intercropping now, intergrazing. We want to create a direct-to-market, fully vertically integrated system, and through the automated farmers markets, the slaughterhouse, the meat cutters, everything as we go forward. That that sweet corn patch, the pumpkin patch, right after we bought the meat company, COVID was most of the restaurants shut down, so we had a truck that we were able to go to Rural King and put shelving in here, and we just parked this out front of that sweet corn and pumpkin patch and sold meat, so they could go out, pick their sweet corn, get a steak, maybe go get a 6-pack of beer, and it was a good night, But a big goal in the future as we go forward is to promote agritourism. This is my son here in the chicken coops. We want to do nothing on our farm where we wouldn't want someone to come out and look at it. And that's really going to increase the value. One things that we're doing a project right now is called a carbon hyperloop, where we're collecting rainfall, and we've got a solar driven coop like this. It's a little bit bigger, but it just moves across in between crops and allows those animals to graze. And we have surveillance on there. So we want people to get on Facebook Live, on YouTube, and be able to see their food being grown at any point, and create systems where we don't have to put the inputs. We just, through design, figure out these natural algorithms through movement and multi-species involvement. It all kind of takes care of itself. Here's a couple pictures of our intercropping this year. We maybe went a little overboard. We had 13 total fields of relay cropping. We did some custom. We collaborated with company Dawn Equipment to create a biochar infused intercropping. I'll get to it here. This is how we seeded last year. So we've got a project right now where we're taking 100 million gallons of hog manure and running that through a digester to get natural gas, regenerative natural gas, a organically kosher nitrogen water, and then biochar. And we took that biochar and mixed it with a seed and some commercial fertilizer, and then took this Dawn Pluribus, which is a high-speed strip till machine. And then we could go into corn right after it's harvested, move that residue to the side. We put a Dawn Duo seed up front. So we wanted to make that 20-inch band of wheat that had the biochar that coated the nitrogen to hold it off till the next spring. It worked out pretty good, but sometimes I just forget about all the stuff we got going on, and sometimes we got to prioritize things. And this kind of showed you a lot of things going on. In the future, we're really going to focus on customers more than acres. But this was another thing we did this year, was 120-inch corn and soybeans, and made it a little bit easier to take care of that separation. We mirrored the corn with the combine traffic and took the corn off first and then the soybeans, and it was okay. I'll just say that. This is a picture of our manure injected wheat. That next spring, this is in 2018, and you can just see when we put the seed right above the manure injection. And keep in mind, we took half the knives off. I drove and shuttered it down to where we only are planting 2,000 gallons of hog manure. But when you put it right above the hog manure, you're going to absorb that into the plant. And you see the difference between that and the commercial wheat right next to it. It's a pretty effective way, and you really change that growth. But anyway, while I got all of you on here, June 25th is when our field day is set for this year. And we have a list of speakers come that are doing a lot of interesting things. I'm really pushing for John Kemp to come and talk this year. We had Zach Smith, which is the stock cropper last year. But we'll go around and look at all of our field projects. We're going to have a bonus day this year where you can come and visit Muncie Meats, our automated farmers market, one of these properties we're looking at to create agritourism. And we network, we have a good time, and then at the end of the night, we have a band from Nashville come out, and maybe we have a little bit too much fun. But my dad always said, you don't really know anyone unless you have a couple beers with them, and I kind of like that sentiment. But anyway, I want to invite everyone here. If you follow me on social media, Twitter, it's Jason Mauck1, and Facebook, Jason Mauck. And I'll be promoting that as we go throughout the year. Where are we at on time now? 11:52. I wanted to leave some time for questions and about. David, if you're on there, I don't know where you want me to end up here, but I can speak a little bit longer, or we can start opening up the questions.
I think, Jason, I did see a question pop up. Could you just read some of the questions you saw?
Yep. The one question I've seen pop into chat so far, and if anybody else wants to ask anything else, now's the time to chime in. But the one question we've had so far is, how does the wheat and soybean double crop work in the event of like low rainfall?
Low rainfall. Well, that goes back to finite mathematics. So this year we were extremely dry. And what happened, this was this year, we saw a lot more variability, but since we weren't greedy, our wheat here made 42 bushels per acre, and our soybeans averaged 67 on this field right here, which was pretty comparable to monocrop. So if you go from a finite mathematics standpoint, 42 divided by 3 would be 14 inches of rainfall. We've really never had a year where we've had less than, say, 26, 27. So that's still going to leave quite a bit of moisture. We've got the thatch, we've got the healthier soybeans that even on a dry year, we're going to have mud in April, May. They're just going to grow better, even if it gets dry, which is really dry early this year. So by not being greedy, by lowering our wheat population, not only are we lowering our variable costs where our break even isn't as high, but we're really hedging our risk of being drier later in the year. So, it could be drier than this year, which probably would make a little bit better venue for our wheat. It might do a little bit better. We can create margins there, and our soybeans might be a little bit off, but you would think this year being this dry, creating some rainfall consumption with wheat would have dropped that down, but we saw comparable. Now, if we have average rainfall or especially wetter spring, then our relay crops will kill our monocrops in yield due to the health of the soybeans and not missing a day as far as too much rainfall.
Jason, do you have a picture about how you're set up for spray application? I know you mentioned about a hooded sprayer. Do you have any photos of that? I'm just curious how.
I do not have it on the slide deck. It was pretty archaic. I went to Lowe's and got some trash cans and cut it out and ratchet strapped it to the boom, and we just did 20 feet at a time. We did the concept on 77 acres, and it worked pretty well. But it's just like everything else. Everything costs money, so
Okay.
just gonna see how it works.
Can you review your herbicide program in your wheat and beans?
So it's going to change a little bit this year. Previously, we've been using Extend, which the problem is you can't get it to joint. So we're out there early, and it's usually too wet, which I really don't like. We've tried some applications in the fall, late November, and it kind of tricks you by not sparking things early, but it wears off. So we're going all in list this year on our regular crop side. So we're going to actually dabble with some pre's in with that, and I'm not sure they're all on label, but I know that it'll work. I'll just say that. So we're going to spike it with some residuals on the 2,4-D, and the 2,4-D label is to boot. So that's going to buy us a little bit more time, there's a big difference between joint and boot in the spring on how dry the soil is going to be.
Okay.
But if we go hood, then you don't have to worry about the wheat, which really opens it up quite a bit. Ideally, we would design something where we spray when we plant the soybeans right behind it.
Great. As far as your fertility program, you pretty much, what I gather a little bit, you're pretty much depending on your nutrients from your hog manure and things like that right along. Does that ever get too more affect your soybeans as far as being too lazy or anything like that with that
No,
application?
no, they love the phosphorus. I really, I overreact a lot, and I got so sick and tired of everyone saying it was all the hog manure. So we didn't do any acres on hog manure this past year. But we're going back to that this year just because it's a very viable system on those acres around the hog barns. But no, I really, we've seen nothing but yield increase, even with manure in the system, even spring manure. We're still seeing it. A lot of it has to do with your water situation and managing that water somewhat on the vegetative growth. It's good to consume some of it.
Great. Well, Jason, I'll definitely keep your date in mind as we go forward, and we'll see if I'd like to come out to your field day. But do you have any other field days you have later in the year for farms to come out, or because of June sometimes a tough time of year? I know I'm speaking kind of selfishly, man.
Yeah.
I like later in the fall or anything like that.
Well, I'm collaborating with Zach Smith, stock cropper. If you're interested in that idea of intergrazing, getting your relay crop that way, then his field day is usually later in September. But our goal is to create a property that's open to agritourism here in the next couple of years that will have be basically revamp the ag educational system where kind of not everything's sponsored by Pioneer, Monsanto, and Bayer and everything like that. It's more of a different spin on agronomy and permaculture and direct marketing and all that kind of stuff. And hopefully that's open next year.
Great. Well, Jason, thank you for taking the time to spend with us. It was very enlightening, and I know I'd seen you on some YouTube videos. I know you're on there as well. So I appreciate your time coming out and spending with us. So thank you very, very, very much.
Well, thank you. Hopefully I wasn't too all over the place.
No, I think you're fine. I just look at the participants. We have an audience of 162 people at least video
Awesome.
in, some maybe share. So I'm really impressed how the turnout is working out for us. So
Awesome.
thank you.
Well,
Wish you the
thank you.
best.
All right. Thanks, David. Thanks, everybody.
Mhm.